Awesome. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. We're just getting started here. The meeting of the Future of Severance Tax and Water Funding Task Force. I just hit record. We've got a nice little agenda today, getting into some of the real the real heart of our charge here on coming towards recommendations and really starting to zero in on a more full report from the task force. And so I've shared the agenda around already, but I'll link it again in the chat for anybody. But wanted to start by talking through the draft report that we discussed at the last meeting. I think we as a group identified a few issues we want to make sure get additional attention from the team at CSU as we move forward. So we'll talk through those. And then the team at CSU has developed sort of an initial framework for us to discuss around recommendations, start trying to zero in on specific policies, buckets of ideas that we'll talk through. The CSU team will sort of lead that discussion. We were talking and thinking about trying to divide the group into two for breakout rooms for that discussion so that we can get into some more detail. Hopefully we can get the tech to work for that. We'll also record sort of both breakout sessions. So anybody in the public who wanted to listen to both has the opportunity to later down the line. We'll do that maybe halfway through the meeting here. We'll come back into the main group and sort of give reports from those breakout sessions, have a group discussion again about those sort of the framework for recommendations. Then we'll have some time for public comment. Anything on this agenda that folks wanted to talk about that's not reflected, or just general thoughts before we dive in? And Karen, would this be a good time to elevate anybody from your team as a panelist to sort of join in the discussion on the draft report?
Sure. I think we can bring in Rebecca Hill,
Great.
and Rebecca Wasserman Olin.
Perfect. Rebecca, I'm hitting promote to panelist now, so you should be able to move to a panelist shortly.
And if we're ready, I can just kind of provide an overview of where we're at with the draft report.
That sounds great. Please jump in, Karen.
Great. Okay, so where we left off, basically at our last meeting, which was the end of January, we had received some initial feedback on the draft report. So we've been incorporating those comments and really trying to get a handle on some of the key areas, including the project needs assessment, kind of the definition of water projects. And then this area where we're going to spend the most time today is the kind of the recommendations or the concepts that we're putting forth as alternatives to severance tax funding. And so we are in the process of wrapping up our interviews. We've got just a few more scheduled, I think, in the next week or two. And again, we're trying to wrap up right now kind of recommendations for those alternatives. And so this meeting, we're really going to focus on, looking at those concepts, trying to identify if there are things that are missing from that list, and then getting a sense from you all what we need to be reporting when we're talking about each concept in the report. What are the different, what's the information that you want to see there, and then how we're going to prioritize those concepts and where we want to spend our most time in the analysis. So that's where we're at. We don't really have any discussion planned significantly for other components in the report right now, just because we want to make sure we spend a lot of time on the concepts discussion. And so Rebecca Hill, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add on the overview of the report.
Nope, I think that was the good overview. Thanks, Karen.
Great. So are there any other questions or comments about the overall report, maybe you had some time to think about it some more and you really wanted to bring up something from a section that we didn't discuss at the last meeting. Sounds like
I had
no, it is
one
Monday
thought.
morning. Go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, I remember some conversation of the treatment of sort of local government funding as a sort of subset of severance tax, and I wanted to see if folks had thoughts on whether that is maybe just captured in sort of the recommendations on future funding, or if there was remaining work needed on the sort of the framing around local government and the initial draft report. I just wanted to be sure I was clear on sort of where we were expecting to see additional work on the local government side.
And you're asking for if we feel it's been addressed. Is that the question? I'm sorry, Nate. I'm just trying to.
I guess wanted to make sure that we are giving the CSU team clear direction on whether we and we can continue this conversation, but whether we think the sort of framing language, the history, the sort of existing structure of programs and stuff, whether that part for local governments needs work, or if it's just sort of how we frame future recommendations as it relates to local government. So maybe can put a pin in that for future discussion and work.
Sure. Yeah, I like to do want to talk about it, but maybe not right at this juncture right
That's
now.
fine. Any other thoughts on that piece from anyone? Great.
Yeah, and I know we have some follow-up interviews that we're still planning with DOLA folks to hammer out that piece a little bit more.
I think you have Dave Bowman scheduled and possibly Victor Chen also. Is that correct? Fantastic. Yeah, that's great.
And then Karen or Rebecca, is there any sort of update you can give on the status of conversations, sort of zeroing in on needs assessment and how I know there were follow-up conversations planned or maybe still planned with CWCB, and any update there would be great.
Yeah, I can go, and then Rebecca, if you want to chime in. So where we're at right now, we're planning to describe the information that's out there through the CWCB projects database and information compiled as part of the water plan and the basin implementation plans. And so that's our current, that's the information that we have right now. I think if there's additional information that comes out of our upcoming interviews, we'll include that. But basically, we're planning to just describe what that data is and kind of the caveats associated with that information.
Yes, I'll echo that. And I will also say, as we talk through the recommendations or concepts today, understanding the depth that we need to go into those helps us understand the capacity for how much we put into the needs assessment in addition as well. So this conversation will help kind of inform where that direction goes.
It's great. Thank you both. So, and any further conversation on sort of the draft report as it was presented at the last meeting, or are folks ready to get into sort of discussion of preliminary recommendations or potential categories of recommendations? I think there's a lot to talk about there, so happy to move on if folks are ready.
Great. And I think we are going to have Rebecca Wasserman Olin share a screen. Is that true, Rebecca? I think you should be able to.
I just sent a request.
Okay.
Great. I'll start off. Excited to be here today. Just as a reminder, I'm a PhD student working with the Colorado State research team to put the draft together and the recommendation. So we're really excited about this stage and excited to get feedback from you all about which concepts we should explore more deeply and what depth of analysis. So I'll be presenting this as well as Dr. Rebecca Hill. We'll take parts each. So the main focus today are the recommendations to explore, and this was a document that I believe Nate shared out with the task force. And the key thing that I want to clarify here is kind of the definition of recommendation. So these items that we're sharing today all come from the interviews. It all comes from the answers to the questions when we're asking people, what are your proposed solutions to the challenges you've identified? And what are possible new revenue streams to fill in some of the tax? So I just want to clarify that recommendation level. Also, these have come from the interview. We've compiled them, just everything that's been said to us. So know that this document doesn't necessarily reflect recommendations by the task force. It doesn't say these are going to be in the final document. That's kind of why we're here today, to say these are what's been given to us, which are the ones that we should really spend our time focusing on. So just a brief overview, kind of a few things that I said before. These are compiled as part of the analysis of the interviews and going to be used to pursue more in-depth discussions of solutions to the challenges. Currently, they are super general. So we're doing that on purpose. We heard the discussion in the last meeting of what depth and level of detail should we share recommendations at. So we're starting super general, and we want you to direct us to what level of detail we should go. Overall, the ideas were in 3 core groups: changing the current severance tax structure, water-related ideas, and then alternative opportunities. So we'll go into each of those in depth. And I think we'll also have some discussion as far as which of these ideas are within the scope of this task force and which are not. And questions to keep in mind, these are kind of the key things we're hoping to get from you to be able to prioritize our time. What's missing from this list? What should the top priorities be? As well as what level of detail should the research team pursue? As well as should different ideas be pursued at different levels? And this is the core discussion point that we're going to have today and ask you to focus on during the breakout groups. Now I'll pass it to Rebecca Hill to talk about that level of detailed discussion.
Yes, and I was wondering, Karen and Nate, do we want to go through all of the priorities, or can we take a little time to do this now?
Yeah, I think this is a good place
Great.
to sort of frame the discussion around level of detail, and then we can walk through priorities. So
Great, yes. So yeah, next slide, Rebecca. I think that'll be helpful. So thinking about these solutions, so Rebecca's going to kind of walk through them, but what is kind of the level of detail that we need for these recommendations, right? Are they just very general policy all the way down to full implementation detail, right? So we did hear in some of our interviews that we don't want to give details on, we want to tax X industry because we don't want to give a heads up for X industry, right? So what is the level of detail that we want these recommendations? How specific do we want these recommendations? So you'll notice the ones that Rebecca is going to go through in a little bit are at a very general level, but how deep do we want to go and what level of detail? So I'd love to open it up without kind of leading that discussion, but how much depth are people looking for when we put these recommendations or concepts out there? Yeah, did you want to go through the DD, prop DD example, Rebecca, or do we want, so here's an example, we can just, yeah, go for it, Rebecca.
Yeah, so we thought we would provide an example, right? So these general levels are just a little descriptive, right? What does specific policy design mean? We thought we would take some of the ballot language from Prop DD and use that to say, if we were describing Prop DD in our report as a recommendation, how would it be described at each of these levels to give an idea of what that would look like? So looking at that, that was the legalizing sports betting and using some of the tax to go towards water projects. We have the very general policy level, explore dedicated funding mechanisms such as taxes on newly legalized activities to support implementation of the Colorado Water Plan, right? Super general, very broad idea. We go to a little bit more detail, a described policy that has a mechanism, right? So we're going to legalize sports betting in Colorado and direct a portion of tax revenue to water infrastructure and conservation projects. So we're getting a little bit more specific with the identified industry specifically of what's going to be impacted by this tax and then where that money is going to go. So next comes in more of a specific policy design. You legalize sports betting through licensed casinos and impose a 10% tax on net sports betting proceeds, with the majority of the revenue deposited into a water plan implementation cash fund. So we're getting to quite a detailed level. There's a plan. We have a general idea of what the tax level is going to be and where it's going to go. And then we have the most detailed level, that full implementation plan. So I won't read this whole thing, but it says exactly where legalizing sports betting is going to happen, what the tax level is going to be, and then exactly how that tax is going to be split up to the different recipients. Now, as we had that arrows in the last slide, there's a trade-off, right? This is a single policy. And for those that were involved with this, I'm sure you know the work that went into describing that full implementation detail of figuring out what was the level, how should that breakup go between the different groups. So knowing that as we go in this discussion of what level of detail you all believe is appropriate for this report, knowing that the going with full implementation detail will be a trade-off with the number of recommendations we can explore deeply. So that's why we kind of have this discussion. Do some warrant a general idea? Do some warrant a specific policy design? Is there an idea that you think is really promising that you want us to prioritize our time looking into some of that detailed level that would be more like a full implementation detail? So this is just an example using information that already exists out there. So are there any questions on this before I go into kind of the general policy recommendations that came out of the interviews?
Hey, Rebecca, thanks for that. Oh, sorry, Nate. I was going to say, with these different levels, I'm wondering, at what level would we also include kind of an estimate of potential revenue generated? Like, would that be in each level?
So I think to have revenue generated, you'll have to know the level of the tax or the fee that would exist. So I would say that at the specific policy design level is where you would get that, right? That's when you're identifying what that would be. But it will definitely be that range, right? We've seen with sports betting over the past few years that there were estimates and we're seeing the realities be a little bit different. So we want to have a range knowing that it's kind of our best estimate at what it would be.
Thank you for the overview. I think this is a really important discussion point for how we move forward and want to be sure task force members with thoughts, offer them at this juncture. I certainly have thoughts here, but would love to open it up and happy to call on people if needed, but would love some discussion here.
So Rebecca, I think this is it's fun to see this laid out because this is what some of us went through a number of years ago with DD. Based on that and my lived experience, beyond policy with mechanism, it's all crystal ball. Like there's, I think we can get it as far as policy with mechanism and a target amount. Beyond that, I think reality dynamics with other stakeholders, legislature, all that sausage making is we can't control or predict.
Thanks, Brian. That's helpful, especially from your sort of lived experience there. I, I tend to agree that I think a policy with mechanism strikes the right balance of detail and is hard to get beyond without quite a bit of work. Um, I think as well that having a analysis of pros and cons or challenge, opportunities and challenges along with that, I think provides an opportunity as well. And as we get into the the list of sort of preliminary recommendations, I've got an example on that I want to talk about that I think um, can instruct how we may approach analyzing some of these. So, other thoughts on level of detail? Would folks like to reserve thoughts for after we've got some ideas in front of us? Or I see Sean, you've come off mute.
Yeah, so looking at this right here, this goes back for me to one of the questions is how do we keep the legislature from sweeping these funds into the general fund? And I think you're going to have to get down if you're going to create some sort of new revenue stream here, you're going to have to get it dive down in deep into the specific policy design or maybe even the full implementation in order to protect that money so it doesn't get swept. Because that's been one of my biggest deals with this whole thing is we've got to make, however we do this, we have to make sure it's safeguarded so it doesn't get swept like the current severance tax is being done right now.
Yeah, I appreciate that feedback, Sean. And I think it gets into the next part of the conversation as well around we may have recommendations on how to prevent severance tax itself from being swept, but I think also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like the point you're making is if we're recommending future options, how are we protecting those into the future as well?
Correct.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Can
Jim?
can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, no, I agree with Brian. When I first looked at this list, I thought policy with mechanism. And Sean brings up a good point, but I'm just wondering, we just doesn't seem like we have the bandwidth or the time to do anything beyond that. However, in the mechanism, I mean, you could put, we would only want to implement this if it can't be swept. And somehow then you figure out how you make that happen as you develop the specific design for the policy, but make it clear that, part of that are the reason that we would want this type of funding is that it can't be swept because we want it for our water funding. So I think within that, you could do that, but it just seemed like that we don't have the time to go much deeper than that to me.
Nate, help me out here because you have forgotten more about state budgets than I'll ever know. Uh, I think it seems like, and I've learned recently, I think there's 2.5 ways to protect this money from future sweeps. One is you go constitutional, and so the legislature can't touch it. Two is you run a statutory new tax that is so wildly popular that people are afraid of touching it, and you win with voters at a high rate. And 2.5 is this new concept that Nate, you're gonna have to fill in, is when something is Tabor limited, it doesn't help to sweep it because it screws up the Tabor baseline. Sorry for that poor translation. Are there other mechanisms for protecting this? Because otherwise, if it's statutory and then statute can change.
Brian, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think the first two that you described generally align with my understanding of sort of the firmest possible protections for a fund from transfers via legislation. I think the third you're referencing is when a fund is made Tabor exempt, the the funds are not counted under the state's Tabor revenue limit. And so in most years, or most re years recently, when the state is above the Tabor revenue limit, moving funds from a Tabor exempt to Tabor non-exempt just further increases Tabor eligible revenue and further increases refunds. In a scenario in which the state is under the Tabor limit, increasing Tabor eligible revenue isn't necessarily a budgetary issue, and so it doesn't drive further refunds, and it is maybe a more attractive option in that scenario. So as you sort of framed it as a half protection, and that's maybe not a bad way to frame it. There are others who have thoughts on how to frame that dynamic. Please speak up. But yeah, Eric.
Well, let me with a caveat here that we had some ideas we've been brainstorming, but we have not had a chance to fully vet them with with the policy shop in in this administration. But one of the ideas was, what if we can make it harder for, if it's more, it goes back to what Brian was saying about, a statutory fix, like requiring like a supermajority in order to divert severance. In other words, it would take, 2/3, not just a simple majority vote, but a higher standard, a higher bar to clear, for a maneuver to divert severance away, for backfilling the budget, for example. So it's just basically a variation on a theme, but
Thanks, Eric. So yeah, I mean, to put a bow on this conversation and Sean's suggestion, would this group like a consistent element of each sort of subsection? So, each potential recommendation or policy, describes the idea, a potential mechanism, you know, challenges. Do we want to have a specific section there that calls out how this, what mechanism this fund or this revenue stream could be protected from future sweeps? Or is that better done in a sort of general disclaimer at the top of sort of a recommendation section that, like, as Brian just described, there's very few ways to formally insulate a fund. These caveats apply to all of these ideas, and as future general assemblies consider policies, be aware that these apply for each of these ideas. How would folks like to approach that?
Well, it seems to me we might have to take the approach individually on each topic we might move forward. Just because the funding streams, some will allow certain things and some won't. So I think it's sort of on a per recommendation basis, I would think.
I guess, Steve, for potential new sources of revenue, alternative sources of revenue, having a section that would describe these different ways of how to insulate funds from sweeps as kind of a general application to that type of revenue.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And you could recognize that this generalization is going to apply to some of these, but maybe not all recommendations, just on how they're structured.
Okay. Yeah, I would say too, this feedback has been really helpful. I think depending on the number of different concepts or recommendations that we have, if we know what this group's, let's say, top 5 priorities are, being able to go into as much detail as possible on those top 5 could be helpful. But it sounds like, that won't really go beyond policy with mechanism as we're describing here. Plus, what Nate was saying, kind of the pros and cons or the opportunities and barriers to implementation. Just trying to, wrap it up here, summarize. Does that sound appropriate?
I think so. And I think as we get into these, maybe we'll realize what Steve is talking about, that maybe they don't all fit with a general recommendation. So as we get in, I think maybe it'll become more clear to us, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jim. And yeah, these conversations definitely feed off each other, but yeah, thought it would be good to frame this conversation up first. But yeah, we can keep sort of the threads of this going as we talk about specific ideas. Is any other overarching thoughts? And then we can sort of dive into those overarching or, the specifics. And I'll just note for the group and folks listening in, it has become apparent that my Zoom account likely lacks the ability to do breakout rooms. So I think we will be discussing this all together. So big deal, but just FYI, I think we're all sticking together for the remainder here. Great. Well, Karen, Rebecca, should we?
Maybe we should add a specific policy design to make sure that we can get you that fancier account in any future mechanism.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean this task force is we are funded by severance tax revenue, so it's just within our charge. Cool. All right. All right, yeah, let's move on. I'm looking forward to getting into some of this stuff. I know I've got thoughts, and I'm sure others do too.
Great. I think I'll continue on. One thing that I did just want to note from the discussion is something that like Brian said and Sean said, in thinking about estimating like a general target or like potential revenue stream, we would have to go to that specific policy design level. And that's just a decision of how you report it, right? Estimating the percent needed on a tax would get you your expected revenue. So I just wanted to say that in order to have that, like this would bring in 20 million, 50 million, we would likely have to go to that specific policy design level. I just wanted to note that going in. So we'll go through each of those 3 categories now and which ideas from our interviews fit in each. So the first category was the changes to the current structure of severance tax. And what was expressed that the key goal would be improving stability and sustainability of the current tax. So that was noted as a big challenge, and these would address those challenges. So the general ideas were mitigating impacts from general fund sweeps, evaluating the tax credit, especially the ad valorem tax credit, reevaluating severance tax distribution, establishing a revolving loan fund or trust, and then partnerships and collaborations for long-term solutions to be able to develop that level that's the full implementation detail. So those were the 5 that we have that I'll now open it up and hand it back to Karen and Nate to lead the discussion. Unless you want to go through all 3 slides and then do discussion.
So I would love to just give a general note here. So, um, appreciate the fact that, everyone's done interviews that sort of led to this list here. I think I wanted to point folks in particular to number two and number three. So evaluating tax credits, reevaluating severance tax distribution. And I think we've talked about this at previous meetings. I think these are, in many people's opinion, unresolved issues related to the way severance tax is collected and distributed. But there has been a lot of previous work from previous working groups, task forces that I think we will have summarized in the report and point people to, to the extent that policymakers want to implement these those potential measures, like those ideas are out there. And so I don't want to keep the task force from coming up with creative ideas that might fit within our charge. But I think that these ideas are things that I've been envisioning the task force would summarize previous work and not spend a lot of time addressing. And that's again specifically numbers two and three, tax credits and distribution. I think numbers one, four, and five likely fall more squarely within the charge of the task force. Yeah, happy to talk about that if folks have sort of different thoughts, but just wanted to share that overarching view. Can I read silence as general agreement? Okay, I see some thumbs up. That's good. Um, and so should we maybe talk about maybe one, four, and five? So mitigating impacts from general fund sweeps it's pretty general. I think there's, and again, that's the goal of sort of this stage. Um, and I think this gets back at our previous discussion around level of detail. This this could have a number of different policy ideas with different mechanisms included in here. And I think one that has been thrown out already by task force members is some sort of referred measure or measure at the voters that debruces severance tax and takes it out from under the Tabor limit. I think there are other ideas, but I guess how are folks feeling about categories, this category and what ideas we might evaluate? Does this change anyone's mind on the level of detail that we should go into? Because I do think we could, for this idea, we could probably have, based on just what we've discussed already, one, two, maybe even three different potential concepts to evaluate.
Can you give me an example of what you would mean by debrucing severance tax?
Yeah, I think what's been discussed in previous meetings would be a referred measure to the voters that, as I understand it, would essentially say, without changing the incidence of severance tax on, oil and gas and metal and, mining materials, without changing the structure, I don't know exactly what the language would look like, but shall the state designate this as Tabor exempt revenue? Um, at which time, it would no longer be counted under the state's revenue cap and sort of as we discussed before, would make it less beneficial for there to be sweeps into the general fund in the future. So I think that's one mechanism that has been thrown out to accomplish that.
So Nate,
I'm sure there are very complicated legal questions tied into that potential path, but sorry, Steve, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, but just to clarify, it does not prevent those sweeps. It just makes them less beneficial to the General Assembly in some years, right?
That is my understanding.
Okay, thanks.
I'm still confused on a less beneficial because
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to sweep it and you need the money, it's beneficial. I mean, I don't understand how we make it, how it's going to make it less beneficial when the state needs the money or wants the money to balance their budget or whatever,
I think the
or
crux,
whatever the need may
yeah,
be.
I think the crux, Sean, is if the state's already over the Tabor limit, any exempt revenue brought into the general fund just pushes more refunds out the door, as opposed to if we're under the Tabor limit, that revenue could be used to help balance the budget. But if we're over the Tabor limit, which we have been most of the past decade, then it just pushes more money out the door in refunds to do those sweeps. I think that's the crux.
We could, and I'm gonna already you know, go against what I said that we should do based on the last slide, but we could suggest or recommend that we run a debrucing measure that specifies that, hey, without raising taxes, severance tax, which funds water and local governments, shall be kept and spent by the state. And so the debrucing would do the half, and then, we'd have to sort of run with it and do the things that you need to do with ballot initiatives, including polling it and testing it. But if it's a winner and it wins, that sends that political signal to the legislature of, hey, voters really want to see this go to these two activities, and just further discourages sweeping.
Well, I personally, I kind of like that. I think that'd be something to look at if we could get something like that going. I mean, it would be, to me, that would be beneficial for both. That'd be beneficial for local governments and for your water if you could get the verbiage correct on that. And we're not creating a new tax. We're not, trying to come up with things on our other list that I know we're getting ready to talk about. But I think that, me personally, I think local governments could get behind that, and I think your water people could get behind it too.
Can I ask, since we're now doing our breakout groups, we had a few questions to consider for each kind of section. And so, yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Out of these, is there anything missing here that we're not including that could improve stability and sustainability of current severance taxes?
Well, I would just, I guess, add that. So in my mind, I look at this sort of as there's a short-term need and a longer-term need. And in my mind, the longer-term need, what makes sense to me at least, is some sort of permanent trust fund where you fund it, it's involatile, it can't be swept, and you live off the sort of interest revenues from that. Takes a long time to set that up and get it up and running. So then you have to deal with how do you deal with the short-term financial shortfalls now? So I think all that's covered here. But again, I always split it into those two buckets.
Yeah, permanent trust would fall under bullet 4. So that's often there were similar recommendations that are lumped into each of these bullets. So yeah, we definitely have that one on this list.
But I think that's a good point, Steve, where, the recommendations, this what we like to call these, like this menu of options that we're going to put forward, it might not be just one, right? It might be this is going to address kind of the short term gaps, and this will address the longer term need over time. Or maybe it's even more than that. So thanks for that point.
Yeah, and I think pointing out in the write-up the interplay that some of these could have with each other to, one idea making the other more effective. I think that's something that would be great to highlight. And Steve, I like the way you framed sort of the short and long-term issues here. And I think this bucket can address both. I think some of the other buckets we'll get into talking about are sort of all longer term, but I think this is the bucket where we can really affect both. I'd love if Rebecca or Karen, if you all could provide a little bit more detail on sort of what has been communicated to you all on number 5 here around partnerships and collaborations. Would love to sort of better understand the sort of frame in which that's been discussed in your interviews and outreach.
Yeah, I think this one has been framed kind of two different ways. So one is really looking at working on getting to that level of detail needed to like take it to a voter if it is going to be a ballot initiative. So the additional work that's going to be needed for it to be an implemented idea versus a concept. So there was a recognition that just like someone referenced here, that there was polling that was done and a lot of other work before it can go to a ballot initiative. That was kind of having that bucket there. And then the other way that this was brought in was really the idea that when you're changing how Severance is currently working or looking at taxing new ideas or fees on new sectors, things like that, it's really important to make sure that you have communication with those being impacted by it in the development of that process. So that was one thing that was noted, was like for changes to be successful, making sure that you have some of that open communication through the process will help increase the likelihood that it will be enacted or brought to fruition. So those were kind of the two avenues that it was discussed.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's helpful. So I appreciate the discussion here and some of the direction I think that's already been provided. Do folks have other thoughts on this piece, or CSU team, were there other elements of this you wanted to discuss before we moved on?
I think moving on to the next set of recommendations might be the best plan.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next big bucket was a tax or fee on water uses. So the key goal here was to have water being used in the state support water projects in the state, kind of that clear line between the two. And I wanted to start with the note on the bottom. One thing or two things that we heard from people in the interviews was not to add a tax to agricultural water uses or add an extra burden to the average or below average resident in the state and their water use. So keep that in mind as we're talking about some of the general ideas. So 3 of the ideas that came up on fees or taxes on water were fees on non-drinking water, fees on water transferred outside of its own basin as like a permanent resource being moved, or a permanent move of a resource. And then the third one is some type of like higher rates or additional fee on top tier residential water users.
And so this bucket is the area where I had an example from the past that I wanted to highlight and wanted to get folks' thoughts on, you know, I think some of these ideas and some of probably the next ones get really tricky because they target, they potentially target specific user groups. It I want to be clear that if the the task force does not recommend any of these ideas or says, hey, the challenges outweigh the benefits, we don't recommend this, or only a subset of us think this is a good idea, that is fine. I think again, this is meant for discussion only at this stage. And I think explaining if the task force chooses not to recommend a given concept, I think explaining the reasoning why will be important so that future policymakers can understand not just the task force's thinking, but the factors and challenges that make something really challenging to implement. So on this number one here, when you look at how should we fund water, a fee on administration of water is a pretty obvious first thought. But I wanted to point out that in 2003, the General Assembly passed Senate Bill 03278, which implemented a fee on water administration. So every water right holder, and the fee was calculated in different categories based on the type of use. The bill passed, was signed. Division of Water Resources began implementing and setting up a program to collect that fee. Very promptly, there was large public outcry, and in 2004, the legislature adopted House Bill 04-1402, which repealed that new fee in its entirety. And so this first concept here, at least in one form and one mechanism, has been implemented and repealed in the past. And I think if the group thinks there's another way to structure that, or the politics of the issue have changed such that it might be implementable now, that's great. I think we can have that conversation. If not, I think explaining that history, explaining the reasons why it's challenging, I still think is a valuable use of this group's time and resources. And yeah, would just love folks' thoughts on that piece.
Well, I guess it's hard in my mind to analyze this when we don't know what the cost of that fee on any individual user is versus what would be the total amount generated. That sort of cost benefit. Like your example, what was the cost on each water user at that point? I don't know, but was it really, large, small? So there's got to be some numbers put on this for consideration in my mind and to understand it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Steve. I think we can memorialize this as the team's working on it. I actually do have those numbers in front of me right now. So for direct flow diversions of water of greater than 1 cubic foot per second, agricultural irrigation, recharge, and stock watering were charged $10. While all other beneficial uses were charged $250. I think that was a flat fee, but we can confirm that. And then
Well,
for storage, that fee was for ag irrigation, recharge, and stock watering was $25 for storage above 100 acre feet and $100 for all other beneficial uses. And again, I believe that was a flat fee.
was that on new applications or annual charge?
I believe it applied to all diversions, even historic diversions
On an
predating
annual
COVID.
basis.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So I think it is my expectation that as we work forward, we would have sort of a real breakdown of what that looked like in the past to help you answer that question sort of precisely, Steve, because I think that's a great point.
And that was just a one-time annual fee. Like they were only charged once that year, not like a recurring usage.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
But Karen, CSU team, I pulled up this legislation and a state engineer's report just this morning before we got on. So I will share all this information so it can be reflected.
Yeah, I'll just add that this one was had a lot of different ideas in this first bucket. So I also just want to point out that this included a lot of like non-tap beverages as well. So this included different types of like purchases of liquids, partnering with industries that use water to create other drinks. Like, especially it was said, breweries already prioritize water projects often in their own philanthropy. So is there an opportunity to partner there? So I think non-drinking water included beverages, additional industries that are creating similar things. So yes, there's a lot in this top bucket. I wanted to clarify. And also one point, maybe Karen or Rebecca Hill might be good, but it would be good to have a little discussion as well on like the depth needed of like historical attempts to do similar things in the past, because I think that would change kind of that level of depth on each idea. So I just wanted to ping that on one idea from hearing what you said, Nate. But
And I can elaborate on that request a little bit, right? We really need your feedback on how we prioritize our research over the remaining time, right? There's a trade-off between researching and providing more detailed analysis for some of these ideas and concepts, and some of the other aspects of our report. So kind of understanding like what Rebecca just brought up, bringing up, okay, what are the details on past attempts versus how deep we go down on that general to more detailed. To understand how we prioritize our time going forward.
Yeah, I think on the first one, you'd probably get pushback again. And it seems like it would be interesting to know how much they thought they could collect with $10 on, and how they're going to separate it out. I mean, we have a lot of different water rights, so how all that works, but I guess it's each water right separately. And I'm just thinking of augmentation plans in our area, and we have wells, we have in one augmentation plan. So you have 300 wells. So is each one charged? And then they might have a recharge water right, but it's maybe an overarching recharge water right, but individual ones that go into ponds. It just seems like really difficult to get a handle on in my mind of everything that would get charged and how they would be charged. And that would be important. I mean, for instance, North Sterling, what do we have? 5 water rights. So that's not that many. But then we have individual recharge ponds under those water rights that has some rights to take some water. So is that an additional one? But we divert a lot of water. And is it fair to charge us $25 for storage when we end up diverting 133,000 acre feet every year? And I'm just trying to grasp how that would be carried out, and it seems pretty hard. And I think there probably would be some pushback, of course, and you're taxing the people that probably need the money for water projects. So does it help that much? So
Yeah, thanks, Jim, for all that. I'm going to, while we're talking here, send the link to this state engineer's report that includes this information. But just quickly to answer your questions, they had calculated, at least subject to the bill, and again, there were flow and storage limitations like bounding this analysis, but they identified 10,000 water right owners, 10,037, 33,700 water rights applied to those 10,000 owners and expected to collect about $2 million based on the fee structure. So I just to briefly answer your questions, I don't know what to do with that information in this moment, but I will share this report as we're talking here. But I think you correctly flagged, Jim. Implementation, I believe, was a challenge. And this report flags over 7,000 of the 10,000 water right owners did not reply to invoices.
yeah, I would imagine. And how much it costs to implement it. It's kind of curious how that would be carried out too.
Agreed.
Can I just go back to Rebecca Wasserman Olin and Rebecca Hill's comment on the how much depth to go into historical information? Was that more a question of like, um, for example, if we talk about this previous bill that was implemented, we spend time describing that effort, but then don't spend time going into a new analysis? Is that the trade-off that you were referring to?
It could be that, or we look at fewer of these ideas, right? Like right now we have 12 of them out there, right? Can we narrow down the number of general ideas and then go more in depth? So there's kind of a trade-off there. Does that help, Karen?
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess that does get back to like sort of the intent of this conversation. Like, does the task force want to have CSU spend time evaluating that history and so that this group can come to a very well-informed decision on whether to pursue this? Or is there an opinion amongst the group that it's not worth spending that time because we may not recommend it at all?
To me, identifying that history and sort of giving some sort of reference, Nate, like you did, and the report is good, but doing an analysis on it, I think that's more incumbent upon us to go back and look at that material as we see fit and not have the team spend a lot of time on it.
Agreed. I think that history is really important and that context, especially given that it was raising $2 billion a year. And we're talking about $160 million annually that we're looking for. I think it speaks to the challenge for sure.
I apologize. I'm still working on the link to this report. I've got it opened as a PDF and just trying to identify the link where I actually found it.
Rebecca, maybe this is helpful, maybe it's not. You mentioned that there were 12 sort of options. Could we like is that something that we could just put up on the screen and go through?
Well, we could go through the last ones, and then if you look at I think it was kind of a handout that you got before, it has all of these on there. But yeah,
So there's
can we
like,
go
yeah,
for
there's
it?
12 overarching categories, and some of them, like the, point one, fees on non-drinking waters. I think we probably have like four that very like specific levels on what the fee would be on, recommendations from that to go into. So that's where these are the big bullet points, right? So there was a little bit of a discussion of a past attempt, right, on like a fee on bottled water, right? So that could fit within that first bullet of how specific would that recommendation be, a fee on purchased bottled water in the state, or would it be a more in-depth level of an estimation, a 1 cent fee on this to fund this specific priority?
So Rebecca, maybe we can go through all of them and then we'll come back and look at, maybe I can put them all together on a slide and then look at the question of are there any that we can drop off of the list? Because there are so many, even within, each one, there's potentially 4 or 5. So let maybe go on to the next slide while Nate's finding that other bill.
Yeah, and I will say none of the recommendations were as general of a fee as you mentioned, Nate. So they're definitely more specific than what you mentioned of the attempt in 2003. So one thing, but the last big bucket was emerging industries or alternative sectors. So the key goal here was to work with emerging industries, many of them that do have a connection to water, to support items currently funded through severance tax. So this was kind of like taking a similar approach to Prop DD to generate new revenue streams that was directed specifically to the projects currently funded by Severance. So the general ideas for alternative sectors or emerging industries were tourism or outdoor recreation, technology and innovation, renewable energy industries, as well as newly regulated or legalized industries, which is where kind of sin taxes would fall under that fourth bullet.
Are there any general comments on these concepts that we're putting forward? Specific ideas that rise to the top under one of these categories or multiple categories?
I think as well, would love any specific comments folks have, but also curious if the way that this has been structured in sort of three broad categories, changes to the current structure, which was one slide, taxes or fees on water uses, and then emerging industries, alternative sectors. Like, do those categories make sense as like inclusive of the world of potential options?
Nate, I'll chime in. I think, yeah, those, when we brainstormed internally, those capture the big areas. I guess if we just jump back maybe to that tax or fee on the water uses, I think that we just had a few concerns about some of the ideas, like the higher rates on top tier water users. I think typically that would go into a municipal utility or a water provider. It wouldn't really come into a state level. So if we're trying to like just knock things off that maybe don't bring revenue in or maybe help address this issue, um, just a comment maybe there. And then on the fees on the transfer outside of its basin, I think that could be I guess I would need more information to maybe contribute in that space, but that seems like it could be a political issue that could be pretty challenging. So I started to jump backwards, but I guess as we're kind of talking through prioritization, those were some thoughts we had.
You could change the water transport outside of its basin to from ag to municipal, and that would cover both a trans basin and an inner basin. It may be more palatable, maybe not.
Yeah, but Jim, then you're relying on that water to be transferred for the money, and maybe you don't want that.
That's true. Good point. I'll take that back.
One quick item, maybe this is the first bucket, is just I don't know if this is something that Department of Revenue has or if the CSU team would have to do it, but a quick scan of tax rates within Colorado versus neighboring states on things. Whether it's hey, our tax on alcohol is different than other states, and if there is a noticeable delta there, is that an area that might be ripe? So it's not a new tax, it's just a change to existing tax, but inherently an increase.
Yeah, I think we'll make the scan of other state severance taxes more robust. And we found a few more resources as well of like the effective tax severance rates in Colorado. Curious to hear other thoughts on that idea of other sectors, if looking at that is something that people want to prioritize. I will add, maybe, I don't know, Rebecca Hill, maybe I'm out of place adding this. I will say that like in thinking about prioritization, we're economists. So a lot of the like revenue estimations are actually going to take us probably less time than like a full literature scan of what's happening other places, what's being done everywhere, because in order to do a thorough job on that, it really takes some time. So maybe Rebecca Hill can talk about that, of the feasibility of comparing tax rates to other states. I think that'd be quite an undertaking.
Well said. I agree, Rebecca. The trade-offs. Yeah.
I wonder, Brian, I like that idea of, are there places where Colorado is assessing a tax or fee on something where, most states charge more? I wonder, just given how broad that is and how much work it may be, I wonder if there are specific areas where we are able to identify something where we think that might be the case, and we could direct the team to look into that. Um, and that doesn't mean we need to do so now, but maybe if that's something we want the team to look into, sort of providing some direction on, hey, there's X, Y, and Z tax or fee that we think Colorado has a drastically different structure or effective rate to look into.
I think, Nate, that because our time is so short, I think we can make some general recommendations like that at the end of our report saying, hey, we don't have enough time to accomplish this. We would suggest the next step would be to investigate.
Yeah, thanks, Robert.
Can I go back to Anna's comment about some potential bullets to drop off of the list? So higher rates for top tier residential water users, just due to the way in which rates are collected. Does that seem, are folks in agreement that that is not necessarily an option worth pursuing? And, we can describe why that is the case.
Yeah, it seems like those rates are set so locally, then just to say a higher is going to get way complicated within 1,000 different entities.
I agree on that because I know here locally in Meeker that anytime you go over a certain rate or a certain amount of water use, you get billed a higher rate as it is. So, I mean, they have commercial rates. They have all different rates set here for water users for the municipality water. So, that's going to be a mixed bag. God, I couldn't imagine how many different fee structures there are out there in the state for that.
I agree.
And then Anna also mentioned just political challenges with, I think, number 2 and maybe number 1. But were there any other thoughts on feasibility of these or other bullets that you saw? And I saw Rebecca Hill just listed all of them there in the chat.
Yeah, I think Jim made a comment earlier that I thought was interesting. And, I think in general, over the course of Colorado's development and the West, really, it's been determined that, well, one, developing water infrastructure is very expensive, and two, that it's in the public good and should be subsidized at different degrees by the federal and state government. And so Jim flagged, in many cases, those fees may be targeting and collecting revenue from those entities that maintain and provide, water infrastructure for sort of the general public. And so it doesn't make sense to assess that fee on those entities that for so long we've determined are deserving of, or worthy of of some sort of government subsidization. So anyway, I wanted to highlight Jim's thought there because I thought it was a good one.
I'm just thinking out loud still again, which is not good in a public setting. Um, anyway, it just seems like we're coming up with an idea for additional money, whether it's fees on people using the water or whatever it is. But what's to keep the legislature? So we come up with this money and it in part helps fund water infrastructure or whatever. But isn't there a way for the legislature to move all those pots of money around and take the money out of something anyway? I mean, it just seems like there's that potential that we come up with a really good idea and then they somehow through the back door take it out of this place and don't fund the DNR as much over here, so they have to use it for. I'm just wondering how do we keep that in this specific area and keep the funding, and maybe we can't. I'm just wondering
Yeah.
your thoughts on that.
No, they're good thoughts, Jim. And I mean, I feel like the same ideas we were talking about earlier of like, how do we insulate existing severance taxes? So whether it's, ballot action on the ballot, which really would be, either quote debrucing, removing it from the, making it Tabor exempt or creating a trust fund. Like I think those mechanisms kind of, to truly protect any new idea, those would likely need to be in play somehow. So I think those apply broadly to both how we might affect the existing severance tax and how we may recommend any future mechanisms be created.
Can I ask, and Nate, let me know if this is okay to do in our meeting structure here. So because we're not able to go in the breakout groups, it's a little harder to get everyone's individual thoughts. Can I ask folks to put in the chat anything they think is still missing from the list? So if you have any ideas, put those in there for what is still missing. And then after you do that, which I don't want to get these two confused because that wouldn't be good. Which maybe list like one or two concepts that we've talked about here that you see as the highest priority to assess, and put that in the chat. So first, missing, and I'm going to give you like one more minute to do that so I don't get the missing and the priorities confused. What is missing? And then if you don't have anything that's missing, be thinking about a couple priorities for you. And I don't see anything missing here.
I think this is fine, Karen. We can give folks
Okay.
a minute or two to respond. We just ask folks when you type in there to respond to everyone so that folks in the public can see.
Thank you. Okay, nothing under missing. I'm seeing, oh, there's Brian. Great. Yes.
I was inspired by Jim, excuse me, thinking and saying dangerous things in a public forum. But I did a quick Google search of, are there categories of things that Colorado taxes much lower than other states? And there are a few, and I'm sure that the CSU, team could grab some grad students and do like a cool AI thing. Apparently landscaping is something that is exempt in Colorado, but not exempt in most other states. These are the kind of crazy ideas I think that if we truly are turning over on every other stone, like that might be considered.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I know Mindy on our team was also hoping to do a more robust comparison of other states, and so figuring out what the potential gaps, like where Colorado is taxing lower compared to other states, could be helpful. So thanks for that. And so now we're moving on to a couple of priorities in this list, the full list that we have here, 1 through 12 now on the screen. Priorities for analysis. And if you want to call out specifically within, we talked about some more specific policies underneath these components. If you want to call that out, we can do that as well.
Can we just put numbers in there? Okay.
Sure. Yeah, that's easier. And while folks are thinking and writing down things, any other thoughts? Because I think we're going to move on to get public comment soon. So any other thoughts to share on prioritization or next steps for this analysis piece?
Thanks, folks, for putting thoughts in there. I think it's seeing some pretty strong general alignment, which I think is great. And I think as Karen mentioned in just a minute here, since it was on the agenda for 10:25, we'll open it to public comment. But given given where we are in the process, wanted to touch base just a little bit on our remaining timeline at the end of the meeting here, but I'll open it to public comment now. And if our previous meetings are any indication, we have not had folks offer public comment, so I think we should still have a few minutes to chat future work. But with that, anybody joining from the public who wants to offer public comment? If so, raise your hand and I'll elevate you to a panelist. Otherwise, we'll just note that the DNR website has a public comment field, and you're always welcome to offer that. We do have one person, Shawnee Klein from Aurora Water. I'm going to allow you to talk right now.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Yes, thank you guys so much for allowing me to make a comment. First of all, I understand what you guys are trying to get at here, and it's an uphill battle, right, to try to figure out what the right solutions are. The only thing that I would offer is when we start talking about any additional fees on transbasin water transfers and things like that, please always do keep in mind anything that you would potentially have as a fee or tax on a municipality will ultimately make its way to the ratepayers. And so even something like that will eventually make its way to the ratepayers, because that is obviously how we end up paying for everything that we do here, is either through rates or fees. The other thing that I would maybe consider as an option is there a way to maybe have a tax or a fee on extremely large water users, such as data centers that might be coming in? It's just an idea. I know you guys are in the process of creating ideas here, so I'm just going to throw that out there.
Thank you, Shawnee. I appreciate you being our first public commenter in one of our meetings.
Leave it to me to be the
I
commenter.
really genuinely appreciate it. Thanks for your thoughts. Anybody else who would like to offer public comment? Great. All right. Well, as I said, wanted to just briefly touch base on where we are in this process. It's March 2nd. Our final report is due July 15th. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4.5 months till our final report. I think I'll just say I appreciate today's conversation. I think we've officially gotten to the difficult part of this work in evaluating future options, addressing the sensitive political realities of some of these concepts, prioritizing time for research. So thank you for being so engaged today. I appreciate it. I'm sure the research team does as well. I think we've obviously got work to do. I know at our last meeting, Karen did present sort of a schedule into the future. Karen, I'm putting you on the spot here. I don't know if you have that available to share, just so that folks can have a renewed understanding of sort of the benchmarks we've got ahead of us. But I think at our next meeting, I would expect that we would spend more time on the topics we've discussed today, likely with some more specifics built in. Do folks have other thoughts on what our next meeting should look like while Karen pulls up our schedule? Did folks like this 9 a.m. Monday morning time? Because I could go ahead and schedule this again next month if it worked for folks. And so just to read this out, basically from now until mid-April, the team will be diving in on research and analysis. From April 15th to May 15th, we'll be doing report writing. May 15th, a draft report would be sent to the task force for edit and comment. In early June, we'd have a task force meeting to discuss that report and provide any revisions. And then through June and July, we'd be finalizing the content and design. And so just applying this maybe to our meeting schedule. So, next meeting in early April, I think we'd still have an opportunity to direct some work around research based on the updates we get from the CSU team. The following meeting, I think, would be getting an update on the report write-up. And again, another opportunity for direction before we have a draft. So I think really 2 meetings before we have a draft. I think we provided some good direction today. I think the next meeting in April will be a good opportunity for us to provide, last direction on sort of deep dive research before we get to the writing stage. So any thoughts or questions on timing and schedule? Great. Well, really appreciate this group's time and effort and thought on all these issues. I'm enjoying the process. I think the fact that it's tricky makes it fun and interesting. So appreciate folks being willing to think out loud and offer uncomfortable thoughts. And yeah, more to come. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.